The auctioneer's gavel cracked like a gunshot through the afternoon heat, and Sarah Brennan felt every eye in Cheyenne's livestock yard turn toward her as she stood on the platform, her left leg trembling beneath her worn calico dress. It was August 1876, and the Wyoming Territory sun beat down mercilessly on the crowd of ranchers and cattlemen gathered to bid on horses. But Sarah knew they were not looking at her with interest. They were looking at her with pity and dismissal. "Gentlemen, we have here Miss Sarah Brennan, 22 years of age, seeking employment as a cook and housekeeper," the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying across the yard. "She comes with references from the Hartley household in St. Louis, where she worked for 3 years before." "Before what?" a burly rancher in a black hat called out. "Before she got herself crippled." Sarah's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin high. The accident had happened 6 months ago when a carriage had overturned on an icy street, crushing her left leg beneath the wheel. The doctor had saved the limb, but it had healed shorter than the right, leaving her with a pronounced limp that made every step a visible struggle. Mrs. Hartley had been kind but practical. She could not keep a housekeeper who could not climb stairs efficiently or carry heavy loads without difficulty. "Miss Brennan is fully capable of performing household duties," the auctioneer continued, though his voice had lost some of its enthusiasm. "She is educated, well-mannered, and an excellent cook. Shall we start the bidding at $5 a month plus room and board?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah watched as ranchers shifted their weight, looked away, or simply shook their heads. She had traveled 3 weeks by train and stagecoach to reach Wyoming Territory, following rumors of desperate households in need of help on the frontier. She had exactly $2.30 left to her name, and nowhere to return to even if she wanted. Her parents had died of fever when she was 16, and she had no siblings, no family waiting for her anywhere in the world. $4, someone finally offered, a thin man with a pinched face. "But only for kitchen work. I won't have her trying to do anything that requires quick movement. She's lame in one leg." Another rancher called out, a big man with silver hair and a thick mustache, his tone dismissive and final. Thaddeus Carver owned the largest cattle operation within 50 miles of Cheyenne, and his word carried weight in these parts. "I wouldn't hire her for any price. A ranch needs workers who can move fast, not limp around getting in the way. This is a waste of everyone's time." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough in the past 6 months. Cried when the doctor told her she would never walk normally again. Cried when Mrs. Hartley had given her final wages and a letter of reference. Cried during the long journey west when she wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. But she would not cry here, not in front of these men who already thought her worthless. $3 is my final offer," the thin man said. "She can peel potatoes and wash dishes. That's about all she's good for. Now hold on just a minute." The voice came from the back of the crowd, deep and rough as gravel, and every head turned to see who had spoken. A man pushed through the gathered ranchers, and Sarah caught her breath despite herself. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, tied back with a leather cord. His face was weathered and tanned, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of dark beard. He wore buckskin pants and a simple cotton shirt that could not hide the powerful muscles of his arms and chest. Everything about him spoke of raw strength and self-reliance. "Who is that?" Someone whispered. "That's Caleb Stone," another answered. "The mountain man who brought in those pelts last month, lives up in the Medicine Bow Range, hardly ever comes to town." Which walked up to the CLR Parara with an sigh, confident stride. To his BOOT tires S and through THU. His eyes, A striking gray-blue color that reminded Sarah of storm clouds met hers, and she saw something in them that she had not seen from anyone else that day: respect. "Let me get this straight," Caleb said, turning to address Thaddeus Carver directly. "You are refusing to hire this woman because she has an injured leg." Carver bristled at the challenge in Caleb's tone. "That's right. A ranch is no place for a cripple. She would be a liability, not an asset. She's standing right there in front of you, strong enough to have traveled across half the country to get here," Caleb said, his voice steady but with an edge of steel. "She's got more courage in her little finger than most men I have met, and you are judging her worth based on how she walks." "It's a practical matter," Carver insisted. "I need workers who can handle ranch life. That requires 2 good legs." Caleb looked at Sarah again, and this time she saw the corner of his mouth quirk up in something that might have been a smile. "She still walks right to me," he said quietly, but his voice carried across the yard. "And walking is just one way of getting somewhere. I have seen men with 2 good legs who could not find their way out of a paper sack, and I have seen men with far worse injuries than hers who could outwork any 3 regular hands. You are all fools if you cannot see what is standing right in front of you." He turned to the auctioneer. "I will hire her. $10 a month, room and board, and I will provide transportation to my cabin. She can start today if she is willing." The auctioneer blinked in surprise. $10. "Sir, that's more than twice the going rate for—" "I know what I am offering," Caleb said flatly. "Is she available or not?" Sarah found her voice, though it came out shakier than she would have liked. "Where is your cabin, Mr. Stone?" "About 30 miles northeast of here, up in the foothills of the Medicine Bow Mountains," he replied, meeting her eyes again. "I am not going to lie to you, Miss Brennan. It is isolated, and the work will not be easy. I am gone for days at a time hunting and trapping. You would be alone often, and the cabin is rough compared to what you are probably used to. But I give you my word that you will be treated with respect, paid fairly, and kept safe. And I do not care one bit about how you walk." Sarah's heart was pounding. Every practical instinct told her to be cautious. This man was a stranger, and his cabin was far from civilization. But she looked at the other men in the yard, at their dismissive expressions and casual cruelty, and then she looked back at Caleb Stone's steady, honest gaze. "I accept your offer, Mr. Stone," she said clearly. "When do we leave?" "Right now, if you have your belongings," he said. "I have a wagon just outside the yard." Sarah nodded and carefully made her way down from the platform, acutely aware of her uneven gait as she descended the steps. But Caleb did not watch her feet. He watched her face, and when she reached the ground, he offered her his arm as naturally as if they were at a church social instead of a livestock auction. "My bag is at the boarding house 2 streets over," she said, "but I have not paid for another night's stay." "We will get your bag," Caleb said simply. He looked at the auctioneer. "I assume you need to settle the paperwork." The auctioneer scrambled to produce the necessary forms, and within 15 minutes, Sarah had signed a 6-month contract of employment with Caleb Stone. As they walked through the dusty streets of Cheyenne toward the boarding house, Sarah was intensely aware of the solid strength of the man beside her. He shortened his stride to match her pace without comment, and when they had to cross a particularly rutted section of street, he simply offered his hand to steady her. "You did not have to offer so much money," Sarah said quietly. "I would have accepted less." "I know," Caleb replied. "But you are worth what I am paying, and I will not cheat you just because those other men are too blind to see value when it is standing in front of them." "You do not even know if I can cook," Sarah pointed out, a hint of humor creeping into her voice despite her anxiety. "Can you?" "Yes, very well, actually." "Then that is settled." He glanced down at her. "I should be honest with you, Miss Brennan. I am not an easy man to live with. I am used to solitude, and I am not much for conversation." The cabin is small. You will have your own room with a door that locks from the inside, but we will be sharing close quarters. If that makes you uncomfortable, I will understand if you want to reconsider. Sarah thought about the $2.30 in her pocket, about the way Thaddeus Carver had dismissed her, about the long journey that had brought her here with nowhere else to go. But more than that, she thought about the way Caleb Stone had looked at her, not with pity or disgust, but with simple acceptance of who she was. "I do not want to reconsider," she said firmly. "I appreciate your honesty, Mr. Stone, and I will do my best to earn my wages." "Call me Caleb," he said. "We are going to be living in the same cabin, might as well skip the formalities." "Then you should call me Sarah." They reached the boarding house, and Caleb waited outside while Sarah went in to collect her single battered carpet bag. The landlady gave her a suspicious look when Sarah explained she was leaving immediately, but Caleb's presence outside seemed to reassure her that this was a legitimate arrangement. Caleb's wagon was sturdy and well-maintained, pulled by two strong horses that looked like they could handle mountain trails. He helped Sarah up onto the seat with easy strength, then tossed her bag into the back beside supplies he had obviously purchased in town: flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples that would keep well. As they pulled out of Cheyenne and headed northeast, Sarah watched the town recede behind them. The Wyoming territory stretched out in all directions, vast and empty under the endless blue sky. The plains here were different from anything she had known in Missouri, drier, harsher, but with a stark beauty that caught at her heart. "Have you been in Wyoming long?" Sarah asked after they had traveled in silence for nearly an hour. 5 years, Caleb replied, his hands easy on the reins. "I came west after the war." "Could not stomach the idea of going back to farming in Ohio after everything I had seen. Heard about the mountains out here and decided to see them for myself." "You fought in the war?" Sarah asked, then immediately regretted the question. Men did not like to talk about those years, but Caleb just nodded. "Union Army, infantry. I was at Shiloh, Vicksburg, and Petersburg." "Lost a lot of good friends." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Saw a lot of men with injuries like yours. Some of them were the best soldiers I ever served with." A bum leg does not say anything about a person's character or capability. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat at the simple sincerity in his voice. "Thank you," she said softly. "Most people do not see it that way." "Most people are idiots," Caleb said bluntly, and Sarah found herself laughing despite everything. They traveled through the afternoon, stopping once to rest the horses and eat cold biscuits and jerky from Caleb's supplies. Sarah tried not to be self-conscious as she climbed down from the wagon and then back up again, but Caleb made it easy by simply being there when she needed a hand without making a fuss about it. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the landscape changed. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, and in the distance, Sarah could see mountains rising up, their peaks still capped with snow even in August. Pine forests began to appear, filling the air with a sharp, clean scent that was nothing like the humid summers of her childhood. "It is beautiful," Sarah murmured, almost to herself. "It is," Caleb agreed. "Gets cold as hell in winter, though. I hope you are not expecting mild weather." "I survived 6 winters in St. Louis," Sarah said. "I think I can handle Wyoming." "We will see," Caleb said, but there was no challenge in his tone, just a statement of fact. The cabin appeared just as the sun was setting, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was built of solid logs, chinked tight against the weather, with a stone chimney rising from one end. A small barn stood nearby, and Sarah could see a creek glinting in the fading light beyond the trees. It was isolated and rough, but it looked sturdy and well-built. Caleb pulled the wagon up to the front door and set the brake. "Welcome home," he said simply. Sarah climbed down carefully, and Caleb went ahead to open the cabin door. The interior was dim until he lit a lantern, and then Sarah could see a single large room dominated by a stone fireplace. A rough-hewn table and chairs occupied the center, and shelves lined one wall, holding supplies and equipment. A door on the far wall stood open, revealing a small bedroom with a narrow bed and a simple dresser. "That is your room," Caleb said, gesturing to it. "I sleep in the loft." He pointed up, and Sarah saw a ladder leading to a sleeping area under the roof beams. "There is a lock on your door like I promised." The outhouse is about 20 yards behind the cabin, and the creek is good for washing. Water is safe to drink. Sarah set down her bag and looked around. The cabin was clean but sparse, with the functional simplicity of a man who lived alone and had no interest in decoration. But it was solid and well-built, and the fireplace would keep it warm through the winter. "I will bring in your bag and the supplies," Caleb said. "You should rest. We can talk about household arrangements in the morning." "I can help," Sarah protested, but Caleb shook his head. "You have been traveling all day after standing on that auction platform. Rest." "That is not a suggestion. It is an order from your employer." Sarah wanted to argue, but exhaustion was creeping through her bones. The past weeks of travel and worry had taken their toll, and the emotional strain of the auction had left her drained. She nodded and went into the small bedroom, closing the door behind her. She sank onto the bed and found it surprisingly comfortable, with a real mattress and clean blankets that smelled of pine and fresh air. Through the thin walls, she could hear Caleb moving around, unloading the wagon and settling the horses. His movements were efficient and quiet, the actions of a man comfortable with his environment. Sarah lay back and stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had happened. This morning, she had been standing on an auction platform, being rejected by every rancher in Cheyenne. Now she was in a remote cabin in the Wyoming mountains, employed by a man she had met only hours ago. It should have terrified her, but instead she felt something she had not felt in months: hope. She must have fallen asleep, because when she opened her eyes again, morning light was streaming through the small window. Sarah sat up, momentarily disoriented, then remembered where she was. She could hear movement in the main room and smell coffee brewing. Sarah used the chamber pot she found under the bed, then straightened her dress and hair as best she could before opening the door. Caleb was at the fireplace, tending a pot that hung over the flames. He had changed into a clean shirt, and his hair was damp, as if he had washed in the creek. "Good morning," he said without turning around. "There is coffee on the table, and I am heating water for washing. Breakfast will be ready in a few minutes." Sarah poured herself a cup of the strong, bitter coffee and sat at the table. "You did not have to make breakfast. That is supposed to be my job." "You start today," Caleb said. "Yesterday was traveling. Today you can get settled, and we can figure out how this is going to work." He brought the pot to the table and ladled out 2 bowls of what looked like cornmeal mush with dried berries mixed in. It was simple but filling, and Sarah realized she was ravenous. They ate in silence for a few minutes, and then Caleb said, "Let me lay out what I need. I am gone 2 or 3 days out of every week, hunting and trapping. Sometimes longer if I am tracking game or working a distant trap line. When I am here, I need hot meals, clean clothes, and basic household maintenance. When I am gone, you will have the cabin to yourself. I keep the place stocked with food and firewood, and I will show you where everything is." Sarah nodded. "That sounds reasonable." "What about other supplies? If I need something for cooking or cleaning, make a list, and I will get it when I go to town," Caleb said. "I go about once a month to trade pelts and stock up. You can come with me if you want, or stay here if you prefer." "What about?" Sarah hesitated, then decided to be direct. "What about other women?" "I do not want to make assumptions, but if you have a wife or a sweetheart, I should know." Caleb's expression did not change. No wife, no sweetheart. I live alone because I prefer it that way. He met her eyes. And just to be clear, I hired you as a housekeeper and cook. Nothing else. You do not need to worry about me making unwanted advances. That is not who I am. Sarah felt relief flood through her. Thank you for saying that. I did not think you were that type of man, but it is good to hear it directly. Fair enough, Caleb said. He finished his breakfast and stood. I am going to check my trap lines today. I will be back before dark. The chickens need feeding. The coop is behind the barn. There are vegetables in the garden that need picking. And if you want to take stock of the kitchen supplies and start a list of what you need, that would be helpful. I can do all of that, Sarah said confidently. Caleb nodded and headed for the door, then paused. Sarah, if you need anything or if something happens, fire 3 shots from the rifle by the door. I will hear it and come back. Thank you, Sarah said, touched by his concern. After he left, Sarah stood and looked around the cabin with new eyes. This was her home now, at least for the next 6 months, and she was determined to make it work. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The chickens were easy to find and happy to see her, pecking eagerly at the grain she scattered. The garden was surprisingly well maintained for a bachelor, with neat rows of potatoes, carrots, beans, and squash. Sarah picked what was ripe, filling a basket with fresh vegetables. Her leg ached from the activity, but it was a manageable pain, the kind she had learned to work through. The cabin itself was clean but dusty, and Sarah spent the afternoon sweeping, scrubbing, and organizing. She found Caleb's supplies well stocked but haphazardly arranged, and she took satisfaction in creating a logical system for the kitchen. By the time the sun began to set, she had a pot of vegetable stew simmering over the fire and fresh biscuits baking in the Dutch oven. Caleb returned just as she was setting the table. He stopped in the doorway and looked around, something like surprise crossing his face. You have been busy. That is what you are paying me for, Sarah said. Dinner is ready if you are hungry. They sat down to eat, and Sarah watched nervously as Caleb took his first bite of stew. His expression did not change, but he immediately took another bite, then another. This is good, he said finally. Really good. I have not had a meal like this since I left Ohio. Sarah felt a warm glow of pride. Thank you, I told you I could cook. You did, Caleb agreed. I am glad you were not lying. Over the next few weeks, they settled into a routine. Caleb would leave before dawn to check his traps, sometimes returning that evening and sometimes being gone for several days. Sarah threw herself into her work, keeping the cabin spotless, tending the garden, and preparing meals that made Caleb's rare compliments all the more valuable because they were clearly genuine. But it was more than just work. Sarah found herself looking forward to the evenings when Caleb was home, when they would sit by the fire after dinner and talk. Caleb was not much for small talk, but when he did speak, it was worth listening to. He told her about the animals he tracked, about the changing seasons in the mountains, about the Shoshone and Arapaho people he sometimes traded with, and the respect he had for their knowledge of the land. Sarah, in turn, found herself sharing things she had not spoken of in years: her childhood in a small Missouri town, her parents' deaths, the loneliness of working in a household where she was neither family nor friend. Caleb listened without judgment, and Sarah realized that she had not felt this comfortable talking to anyone since before the accident. One evening in late September, Caleb returned from a 3-day trip with fresh elk meat and the news that winter was coming early. I could smell snow in the air up high, he said as he helped Sarah hang the meat in the smokehouse. We probably have a month, maybe 6 weeks, before the first big storm. What do we need to do to prepare? Sarah asked. Wood, Caleb said immediately. We need a lot more firewood than what I already have cut. And I want to make sure we have enough supplies to last through a bad storm. Sometimes the snow gets so deep you cannot leave the cabin for days. Then we had better get started, Sarah said practically. Over the next weeks, they worked together to prepare for winter. Caleb cut wood from dawn to dusk, and Sarah stacked it against the cabin walls and under the overhang of the barn. She helped him smoke and preserve meat, can vegetables from the garden, and check every inch of the cabin for gaps that might let in the cold. It was hard physical work, and Sarah's leg ached constantly, but she refused to complain. She had something to prove, to Caleb, to herself, to every rancher who had dismissed her in Cheyenne. And slowly, she felt herself growing stronger. The muscles in her good leg became more defined, and she learned how to use her body efficiently to compensate for her injured limb, Caleb noticed. "You are getting better at that," he said one afternoon, as she carried a heavy basket of vegetables from the garden without stumbling. "I am learning to balance differently," Sarah said. "It is a matter of figuring out how my body works now instead of trying to make it work the way it used to." "That is a good way to look at it," Caleb said quietly. Most people never learn that lesson. The first snow came in early October, a light dusting that melted by noon. But they both knew it was a warning of what was coming. Caleb made one more trip to Cheyenne for final supplies, and this time he insisted that Sarah come with him. "You have been stuck out here for 2 months," he said. "You should get a chance to see other people, buy anything you want for yourself." Sarah agreed, though she felt oddly nervous about returning to Cheyenne. The town looked the same as she remembered, but she felt like a different person. She was stronger now, more confident, her skin tanned from outdoor work and her hands calloused from honest labor. They were loading supplies into the wagon when Thaddeus Carver approached, his silver hair gleaming in the autumn sunlight. "Stone," he said with a nod. "I heard you were in town." "How is that crippled girl working out for you?" Sarah stiffened, but Caleb's expression did not change. "Her name is Sarah Brennan, and she is the best worker I have ever had. Why do you ask?" Carver looked surprised by the response. "I just figured she would have been more trouble than she was worth. Ranching is hard work." "It is," Caleb agreed. "And she does it better than most men I have met, including some who think too highly of themselves." His tone was mild, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Carver's face reddened, but before he could respond, Caleb helped Sarah up onto the wagon seat and climbed up beside her. As they drove away, Sarah said quietly, "You did not have to defend me." "Yes, I did," Caleb said flatly. He was being an ass, and someone needed to tell him so. Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest, and she realized with a start that it was not just gratitude. She enjoyed being around Caleb. She liked his quiet competence, his dry humor, his absolute lack of pretension. She liked the way he treated her as an equal, never coddling her but always ready to help when she needed it. She liked him. Really liked him. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. Caleb was her employer, and she was dependent on him for her livelihood. More than that, he had made it clear from the beginning that he preferred solitude. He had hired her as a housekeeper, not as a potential romantic partner. But as they rode back toward the cabin through the golden afternoon light, Sarah could not help stealing glances at his strong profile, at the capable hands holding the reins, at the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, where it had come loose from its tie. The snow came in earnest 2 weeks later. Sarah woke one morning to find the world transformed, everything covered in a thick white blanket that muffled sound and turned the forest into a fairy tale. Caleb looked out the window and nodded with satisfaction. That is a good start to the season, not too heavy, not too light, but the storms that followed were heavier. By mid-November, snow was piled waist-high around the cabin, and the temperature dropped so low that the coffee froze in its pot overnight if they let the fire go out. Caleb could not check his distant trap lines, so he focused on keeping them supplied with fresh meat and firewood. The close quarters of the cabin during the long winter evenings brought them together in new ways. They played cards by the fire, and Sarah discovered that Caleb had a sly sense of humor that emerged when he was relaxed. He taught her to play chess using pieces he had carved himself, and she proved to be a surprisingly good student. "You think 3 moves ahead," Caleb said one night after she had checkmated him. "That is more than most people manage." "I learned to plan ahead after my accident," Sarah said. "Every action requires more thought when you cannot move quickly." "I have to think about where I am going, what I will need to do when I get there, how I will get back." Caleb studied her across the chessboard. "That must be exhausting." "Sometimes," Sarah admitted. "But it also means I do not take anything for granted. Every step is deliberate. Every action has purpose." "I like that," Caleb said quietly. "Too many people just stumble through life without thinking." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw something in his expression that mirrored her own feelings. But then he looked away and started resetting the chess pieces for another game. Christmas came, and Sarah insisted on making the day special despite their isolation. She had been hoarding ingredients for weeks, and she produced a feast that astonished Caleb: roast venison with herbs, biscuits with honey, dried apple pie, and even a small cake made with precious sugar and eggs from the chickens. "This is too much," Caleb protested, but his eyes shone with pleasure as he looked at the spread. "It is Christmas," Sarah said firmly. "We are allowed to celebrate." They ate until they were stuffed, and then Caleb disappeared into the loft and came back down with something wrapped in cloth. "I made this for you," he said gruffly, handing it to Sarah. She unwrapped it and found a beautiful wooden cane, the handle carved and smoothed to fit a hand perfectly, the shaft made of strong, flexible wood that would bear weight without breaking. "Caleb," she breathed, "this is beautiful." "I noticed you have been struggling more in the snow," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "The cane will give you better balance and help distribute your weight. I tested it myself. It is solid." Sarah ran her fingers over the smooth wood, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. Caleb had spent hours on this, carving and sanding and shaping it specifically for her needs. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me." "It is just a cane," Caleb muttered, but his ears were red. "No," Sarah said firmly, "it is not just a cane. It is proof that you see me and understand what I need. That means more than you know." She stood and tested the cane and immediately felt the difference. It was perfectly balanced for her height and weight, and the handle fit her grip as if it had been made for her, which of course it had. She walked across the cabin with more confidence than she had felt since before the accident. "It is perfect," she said, turning to face Caleb. "I do not have anything to give you. I am sorry." "You have been giving me something every day," Caleb said quietly. "A clean home, good food, and company that does not make me want to run back to the mountains. That is more than enough." The silence that followed was charged with something unspoken. Sarah's heart was pounding, and she could see the tension in Caleb's shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Caleb," she started, but he shook his head. "I should check on the horses," he said abruptly, and grabbed his coat before heading out into the cold. Sarah stood alone in the warm cabin, her new cane in her hand, and felt tears prick her eyes. She knew that Caleb felt something for her. She could see it in the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching, in the careful way he had carved this cane, in the gentleness of his voice when he spoke to her. But he was holding back, and Sarah thought she knew why. He saw her as his employee, someone under his protection. He probably thought any advance would be taking advantage of her vulnerable position. It was honorable and frustrating in equal measure. The winter deepened, and January brought storms so fierce that they could not leave the cabin for days at a time. Sarah and Caleb lived in close quarters, their routines so synchronized that they moved around each other without conscious thought. She would wake to find that he had already started the fire. He would return from checking the horses to find hot coffee and breakfast waiting, but the unspoken tension between them grew as well. Sarah would catch Caleb watching her as she worked, his expression unreadable. She knew she looked at him the same way when his back was turned. The air between them seemed to thicken with everything they were not saying. It all came to a head one night in late January. A blizzard had been raging for 3 days, and they were both getting cabin fever. Sarah was washing dishes after dinner when her foot slipped on a wet spot on the floor. She stumbled, and even with the cane, she could not catch herself. She went down hard, landing on her injured leg with a cry of pain. Caleb was across the room in an instant, dropping to his knees beside her. "Sarah, are you hurt?" "My leg," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I landed on it wrong." Without asking, Caleb scooped her up in his arms and carried her to the chair by the fire. His strength was effortless, as if she weighed nothing at all. He knelt in front of her and carefully examined her leg through her skirt, his touch gentle but thorough. "I do not think anything is broken," he said finally, "but you are going to have a bad bruise. I have some salve that will help." He retrieved a tin from his supplies and came back to her. "I need to see your leg," he said quietly. "May I?" Sarah nodded, her face burning. This was highly improper, but propriety seemed less important than the throbbing pain in her leg. She lifted her skirt to her knee, revealing the scarred and twisted flesh of her injured leg. Caleb's expression did not change. He opened the tin and carefully applied the cool salve to her leg, his large hands incredibly gentle. "This was a bad break," he observed. "The doctor did good work saving it. He said I was lucky," Sarah said softly. "Another inch and I would have lost the leg entirely." "You are strong," Caleb said, meeting her eyes. "Not lucky." "Strong? Lucky does not get you through something like this. Strength does." His hands were still on her leg, and Sarah could feel the warmth of his touch even through the salve. The firelight cast shadows across his face, highlighting the strong bones of his jaw and cheeks. His gray-blue eyes were intense, holding hers with an expression she could no longer mistake. "Caleb," she whispered. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice rough, "and I have been a coward about it for too long." Sarah's heart was thundering. "What is it?" "I did not hire you just because those men were idiots for not seeing your value," Caleb said slowly. "I hired you because from the moment I saw you standing on that platform, refusing to cry even though I could see you wanted to, I could not stop thinking about you. You had more courage and dignity than any 10 men I have ever met, and the more I have gotten to know you, the more damn it." He stood up abruptly and paced to the window, looking out at the swirling snow. "I am your employer. You depend on me for your livelihood. It is not fair for me to say any of this to you. But I have to be honest, Sarah, I have feelings for you, strong feelings. And living here with you every day, seeing your smile and hearing your laugh and watching you grow stronger and more confident, it is killing me not to tell you." Sarah's breath caught. "Caleb, look at me." He turned, and she could see the conflict in his face, hope and fear warring together. Sarah stood up, using her new cane for support, and walked across the cabin to him. It was not a graceful walk, and her leg still ached from the fall, but she made it without faltering. "I have feelings for you too," she said quietly. "I have been falling in love with you since Christmas, maybe even before. Every day I spend with you makes me care about you more. You see me, not my injury, not my limitations, but me. Do you have any idea how rare that is, how precious, Sarah?" Her name was almost a groan on his lips. "Are you sure? I do not want you to feel obligated because I am your employer or because you have nowhere else to go." "I am sure," Sarah said firmly, "and I do have somewhere else to go." I have learned enough living here that I could find work in Cheyenne if I wanted to. Maybe not as a ranch cook, but as a seamstress or a laundress or a dozen other things. I am staying because I want to be here, because I want to be with you." Caleb reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle and reverent. "You are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever met," he said softly. "And if you will have me, I would like to court you properly. I know I am not much, just a mountain man with a rough cabin and no prospects beyond my trap lines. But I promise I will do everything in my power to make you happy." "You already make me happy," Sarah whispered, "every single day." He bent down and kissed her then, and Sarah felt like she was melting. His lips were warm and firm, and he kissed her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. She leaned into him, and his arms came around her, holding her close against his broad chest. She felt safe and cherished and desired all at once, and when they finally broke apart, she was breathless. "I have wanted to do that for months," Caleb admitted, resting his forehead against hers. "So have I," Sarah said with a laugh. "We are both terrible at hiding our feelings." "I am out of practice," Caleb said. "I have not courted anyone since before the war." "Then we will figure it out together," Sarah said. They stood by the fire, wrapped in each other's arms while the blizzard howled outside. Sarah had never felt warmer or more content. She had come to Wyoming territory expecting rejection and hardship, and instead, she had found a home and a man who loved her not despite her injury, but simply as part of who she was. The winter gradually gave way to spring, and Sarah and Caleb's courtship unfolded in the quiet rhythms of mountain life. They worked side by side during the day, he checking trap lines and hunting, she managing the household and garden. But the evenings were theirs, spent talking and laughing and learning everything about each other. Caleb was as good as his word about courting her properly. He carved her small gifts, a spoon, a bowl, a little wooden bird that sat on the windowsill. He picked wildflowers for her when they started blooming in the meadows. He taught her to shoot a rifle, standing behind her with his arms around her as he showed her how to sight down the barrel. And Sarah was very aware that the lesson had little to do with marksmanship, and everything to do with the excuse to touch her. Sarah courted him in her own way, learning what foods he liked best and surprising him with special meals. She mended his clothes with careful stitches and embroidered his initials on his best shirt. She listened to his stories and shared her own dreams for the future. By the time the snow melted and the first spring flowers appeared, they both knew where this was heading. One evening in April, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Caleb cleared his throat nervously. "Sarah, I want to ask you something." "Yes." Sarah looked up from the sewing in her lap. Caleb got down on one knee in front of her, and Sarah's heart began to race. He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold ring. "I do not have much to offer you," he said. "But I have a cabin that is paid for, skills that keep us fed, and a heart that belongs entirely to you. Sarah Brennan, will you marry me?" "Yes," Sarah said immediately, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Caleb slipped the ring onto her finger, and then he was kissing her again, and Sarah thought she might burst from happiness. When they finally pulled apart, she said, "Where did you get the ring?" "I have had it for a month," Caleb admitted. "I rode to Cheyenne and back in 2 days during that warm spell we had. I wanted to ask you properly with a ring and everything." "You rode 60 miles just to buy me a ring?" Sarah asked, touched beyond words. "I would ride 600 miles if that was what it took," Caleb said simply. "You are worth it." They were married in Cheyenne 6 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the small church. Sarah wore a new dress that she had sewn herself, pale blue calico that brought out her eyes. Caleb wore his best clothes and looked so handsome that Sarah could hardly breathe when she saw him waiting at the altar. Thaddeus Carver was in the congregation, And Sarah could not help but feel a small surge of satisfaction when she saw his face as she walked down the aisle on Caleb's arm. She was not limping as much now, thanks to her cane and the strength she had built up over the winter. But even if she had been, it would not have mattered. She was marrying a man who loved her completely, and that was worth more than all the approval in the world. After the ceremony, several people approached them to offer congratulations. One was a young woman with kind eyes who introduced herself as Catherine Mills. "I heard about what happened at the auction last summer," she said to Sarah. "The way your husband defended you. It gave me courage to keep looking for work even though I am a widow with no family. I just wanted to thank you both for that." "You do not need to thank us," Sarah said warmly. "But I am glad things worked out for you." As they rode back to the cabin as husband and wife, Sarah leaned against Caleb's shoulder and felt complete. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. "I have never been happier in my entire life," Sarah said honestly. "You saved me, Caleb, not just from that auction, but from believing that I was less than I am." "You saved yourself," Caleb corrected. "I just gave you the space to do it. And you saved me too, Sarah. I did not realize how lonely I was until you filled my life with light." Their first night as a married couple was tender and passionate, Caleb treating her with a combination of reverence and desire that made Sarah feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. He kissed every scar on her injured leg, showing her without words that every part of her was precious to him. The months that followed were busy and happy. They worked together to expand the garden and improve the cabin. Caleb taught Sarah to tan hides and cure meat. She taught him how to make proper bread and how to keep a house organized. They were partners in every sense of the word, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly. By the fall, Sarah began to suspect she was pregnant. When she was sure, she told Caleb one evening after dinner. He stared at her for a long moment, and then he whooped with joy and picked her up and spun her around until she was laughing and dizzy. "A baby," he kept saying. "We are going to have a baby." "You are happy?" Sarah asked, though his reaction left little doubt. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Caleb said, gently setting her down. "You have already given me more than I ever thought I would have. A wife I love, a happy home, and now a child. Sarah, I am the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy was not easy. Sarah was sick for the first few months, and as her belly grew, her injured leg struggled with the extra weight. But Caleb was attentive and protective without being overbearing. He took on more of the household chores without complaint, and made sure Sarah rested when she needed to. When the baby came in early June, after a long and difficult labor, it was a boy with dark hair and his father's gray-blue eyes. They named him Daniel after Caleb's father, and Caleb held his son with a tenderness that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "He is perfect," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You are perfect. I cannot believe how lucky I am." "We are both lucky," Sarah corrected, reaching up to touch his face. "We found each other when we both needed it most." Little Daniel was a healthy, happy baby who grew quickly. Sarah threw herself into motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else. Her leg ached from carrying the baby, but she managed, and Caleb was always there to help when she needed it. When Daniel was 6 months old, Caleb surprised Sarah by announcing that he had bought the land their cabin sat on. "It is ours now," he said proudly, "registered and legal. I want our son to grow up knowing he has a place that belongs to him that nobody can take away." Sarah kissed him. "You are a good man, Caleb Stone, the best man I have ever known." The years passed in a blur of happiness. Daniel grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who followed his father everywhere. When he was 2, Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth. She had Sarah's dark eyes and Caleb's stubborn chin, and she was the apple of her father's eye. Life in the mountains was not always easy. There were harsh winters and lean years when game was scarce. There were injuries and illnesses that had to be nursed through. But through it all, Sarah and Caleb faced every challenge together, their love growing deeper with each passing year. One summer day when Daniel was 7 and Elizabeth was 5, a group of travelers stopped at their cabin, asking for directions to Cheyenne. Among them was Thaddeus Carver, now in his 60s and looking far less imposing than Sarah remembered. Carver stared at the neat cabin, the thriving garden, the healthy children playing in the yard, and the obvious love between Sarah and Caleb. Finally, he said gruffly, "I was wrong about you, Mrs. Stone. I judged you unfairly, and I am man enough to admit it." Sarah looked at the rancher who had once dismissed her so cruelly and felt nothing but pity. "You judged what you saw," she said quietly. "You did not bother to look deeper. But I do not hold it against you, Mr. Carver. If you had hired me that day, I would never have met my husband. So in a way, I should thank you." After the travelers left, Caleb came up behind Sarah and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You are a better person than I am," he said. "I still want to punch him." Sarah laughed and turned in his arms. "He does not matter. None of them matter. What matters is this, us, our children, our life. This is everything I ever dreamed of and more." "Even on the hard days?" Caleb asked. "Especially on the hard days," Sarah said firmly. "Because on the hard days, I know I have you beside me. That is worth more than all the easy lives in the world." As the years continued to pass, Sarah and Caleb's love story became something of a legend in the area. People talked about the mountain man who had seen value where others saw only disability, and the woman who had proved that strength came in many forms. Young women with injuries or disabilities would sometimes make the long journey to the stone cabin, seeking advice from Sarah about how to make their way in the world. Sarah always welcomed them warmly and told them the same thing. "Your worth is not determined by how easily you move or what other people think of you. Your worth is determined by your character, your determination, and your heart. Do not let anyone tell you differently." When Daniel was 12 and Elizabeth was 10, Sarah gave birth to one more child, a son they named Thomas. He was a surprise and a blessing, arriving when Sarah had thought her childbearing years were over. Caleb was as devoted as ever, staying close to home to help with the new baby, and showing no sign that his feelings had diminished in the slightest after more than a decade of marriage. "You still take my breath away," he told Sarah one night as they sat on the porch of the now expanded cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Every single day I look at you and cannot believe you are mine." "I was thinking the same thing about you," Sarah said, lacing her fingers through his. "I love you more now than I did the day we married, Caleb. I did not think that was possible, but it is." Their children grew up strong and confident, secure in the love of their parents and in their own worth. Daniel became a skilled hunter and trapper like his father. Elizabeth showed a talent for healing and herbs, learning everything she could from her mother and from the Shoshone women who sometimes traded with the family. Thomas was still young, but he showed signs of being a natural leader, organizing his siblings into elaborate games and adventures. When Sarah was 42 and Caleb was 45, they took a trip back to Cheyenne with their children. The town had grown significantly since that day in 1876, when Sarah had stood on an auction platform, being rejected by men who could not see past her injury. Now it had proper stores and a hotel, and the railroad had brought new prosperity. They walked past the livestock yard, and Sarah paused, looking at the spot where she had stood more than 15 years ago. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked Caleb. "Every time I look at you," he said simply. "That was the day my life really began. Everything before that was just waiting." Sarah turned to him, this man who had seen her when no one else would, who had loved her through good times and bad, who had given her a life beyond anything she had imagined. His hair was streaked with gray now, and there were lines around his eyes, but he was still the strongest, most handsome man she had ever seen. "Mine too," she said softly. "Mine too." They stood there for a moment, surrounded by their children, and Sarah thought about the words that Caleb had spoken all those years ago. "She still walks right to me." It had been true then, and it was true now. No matter how she walked or what challenges they faced, she always found her way to him and he to her. As they walked back through the town toward their wagon, Sarah noticed a young woman sitting on a bench outside the general store. She had crutches beside her, and her face was drawn with worry and exhaustion. Sarah recognized that expression. She had worn it herself once. Sarah approached the woman and sat down beside her. "Are you all right?" The woman looked startled. "I am fine, just resting." "You look like someone who has traveled a long way and does not know where to go next," Sarah said gently. "I have been exactly where you are. My name is Sarah Stone." The woman's eyes widened. "You are Sarah Stone. I have heard people talk about you. About how you came to Wyoming when no one would hire you and built a life anyway." "That is mostly true," Sarah said with a smile, "though I had a lot of help." She gestured to Caleb, who was standing nearby with their children. "This is my husband. He was the one who hired me when everyone else refused. He saw past my injury to who I really was." "I am trying to find work," the woman said desperately, "but no one will hire me. They say I am too slow, that I will be a liability." Sarah took the woman's hand. "Listen to me. Your value is not determined by how fast you move or what limitations others think you have. There are people in this world who will see you for who you truly are. Do not give up before you find them." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "How did you do it? How did you keep going, one step at a time?" Sarah said, "sometimes literally." "And by remembering that every no just means you have not found the right yes yet." She paused, then said, "We are looking for someone to help with our youngest child. My daughter is learning midwifery and is gone often. Would you be interested in coming to work for us? Room, board, and fair wages. We are about 30 miles from here in the mountains. It is hard work, but you will be treated with respect." The woman stared at her. "You would hire me, just like that?" "My husband hired me just like that," Sarah said. "Because he understood that character matters more than physical ability. I learned that lesson well. So yes, I would hire you just like that, if you are willing to work hard and be part of a family that values you." The woman, her name was Alice, joined their household, and over the years she became like a daughter to Sarah and Caleb. She eventually married a local farmer who saw past her disability to her kind heart and capable hands. And Sarah and Caleb danced at her wedding with the same joy they had felt at their own. The years continued their steady march. Sarah's hair turned silver, and Caleb's powerful frame grew a bit slower, but their love never diminished. They became grandparents as their children married and had families of their own. The cabin was expanded again and again, becoming a sprawling home that could accommodate the growing family that gathered there for holidays and celebrations. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Caleb and Sarah sat on their porch in the evening, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Sarah's legs still ached on cold days, and she walked with a more pronounced limp now. But the cane Caleb had carved for her all those years ago was still by her side, worn smooth from decades of use. "Do you have any regrets?" Sarah asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then said, "I regret that I did not defend you more forcefully to those ranchers that day. I should have told them exactly what idiots they were." Sarah laughed. "You called them fools. That was enough." "I regret every moment of pain your injury has caused you," Caleb continued. "I wish I could take that burden from you." "It is not a burden," Sarah said firmly. "It is part of who I am. It brought me here to you, to this life. I would not change it even if I could. Then I have no regrets, Caleb said, kissing the top of her head. 30 years ago, I saw a woman on an auction platform who refused to let the world break her spirit. I knew then that she was special. I have spent every day since then grateful that she chose me. I will always choose you, Sarah whispered, in this life and whatever comes after. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Sarah thought about the long journey that had brought her here. She had left Missouri with nothing but a battered carpet bag and a broken leg, rejected by nearly everyone she encountered. But she had found something more valuable than gold in these mountains. She had found purpose, dignity, and a love that transcended every limitation the world tried to place on her. She still walked with a limp that had never changed and never would. But Caleb had been right all those years ago. She walked right to him, and that was the only direction that mattered. Years later, when both Sarah and Caleb had passed on, surrounded by their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, the story of their love was still told around fires and dinner tables throughout Wyoming. It became a reminder that true strength comes not from physical perfection, but from the courage to keep going when the world says you cannot. And true love comes not from finding someone without flaws, but from finding someone who sees past the surface to the precious soul beneath. The cane that Caleb carved for Sarah was passed down through generations, a treasured family heirloom. And carved into its handle, added by one of their grandsons who had learned the craft from Caleb, were words that summed up their entire story. She still walks right to me. It was a love that had started with rejection and transformed into acceptance, that had grown through hardship into something stronger than steel, that had proven that the greatest journeys are not measured by how smoothly you travel, but by the love that guides your steps. Sarah and Caleb's cabin still stands in the Medicine Bow foothills, maintained by their descendants who understand that it represents more than just a home. It represents the truth that everyone has value, regardless of their physical limitations. It represents the power of seeing past the surface to the person within. And most of all, it represents a love story that proved that the right person will always see you, all of you, and love you not despite your scars, but as the complete and beautiful person you truly are. The Wild West was a harsh and unforgiving place, where survival often depended on physical strength and quick reflexes. But Sarah and Caleb's story showed that there were other kinds of strength just as valuable: the strength of character, the strength of determination, and the strength of love that refuses to accept the world's limitations. Their legacy lived on in every person who heard their story and found the courage to keep going despite their own challenges. It lived on in every couple who chose to see past the surface to the heart beneath. And it lived on in the simple truth that Caleb had spoken on that hot August day in 1876. When you truly love someone, they walk right to you, exactly as they are, and that is exactly perfect. The story of Sarah and Caleb Stone became more than just a tale of romance. It became a testament to the power of human dignity, to the importance of seeing people as they truly are rather than how society labels them, and to the transformative power of love that accepts without conditions. In a time and place where strength was often measured by physical prowess alone, they proved that the strongest force of all was the courage to love completely and the wisdom to value what truly matters. And so their story ends not with sorrow or regret, but with the deep satisfaction of a life well lived, a love well earned, and a legacy that would inspire generations to come. Sarah walked with a limp her entire life, but she walked with dignity, with purpose, and most importantly, she walked with the man who had seen her worth when no one else would. And in the end, that made all the difference.